Before we begin on today's episode, I want to personally apologize for not getting this episode out sooner during the holiday season. A lot of issues have come up that have prevented me from getting my work done, some technical and some personal. But more or less, I really didn't want to get into the reasons why I'm doing this, but rather that I have a brand new episode today. But I also have some good news. Starting with this week, we will be back on full-time as scheduled, with brand new movies that are about to be dived into soon, and we have a whole bunch of new Nickelodeon episodes coming soon, and I hope to see you all there. With that being said, let's get right into it.
Marker, and action.
This is Behind the Bells, the show that takes you behind the magic of your favorite Christmas movies and shows. Within the background of every Santa Claus, reindeer, and stocking is a story. Where did it come from? Our Christmas movie expert will unravel all of that and give you the full story. Sit back and enjoy another episode with Robert Nicholas.
Merry Monday, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Bells. I'm your host, Robert Nicholas, and I'll be taking you on another one-horse open sleigh ride into the world of Christmas movies. Here's a brief recap of what we covered in the last episode. Though Christmas can be a safe, calm environment, with the magic of storytelling, anything can seem scary if put in the right context. Santa Claus has been done so many times on film, usually as a savior of the season, something that children look forward to every year. The 2015 film Krampus was one of the first major movies about the Austrian legend who comes to punish the naughty. The movie is family focused, primarily on the son Max, who's trying to keep the Christmas spirit alive in a house where there's little. His cousins embarrass him by reading his letter to Santa, which also highlighted everyone's troubles. This results him into tearing up the letter, unknowingly summoning not Santa, but something much darker. Everyone awakens to find the home colder, without power, and isolated thanks to a whiteout blizzard that cuts them off from the world. Everyone tries to make the best of it, but Max knows something more sinister is afoot. It becomes more evident when his sister disappears and his dad and uncle get hurt trying to find her. Even when they board up the house, another child is taken via the chimney. This is when Max's Austrian grandma, Omi, tells the story of her encounter with the same thing, a dark shadow of St. Nicholas called Krampus, who only comes when the Christmas spirit and love is completely gone. Her family was taken, but she was spared to live with the guilt. They don't get much time to relax as more elements of Krampus start to show up. Demented toys, living gingerbread men, and ghoulish elves all come after the family before Krampus himself comes down the chimney. One by one, family is taken and Max remains. When he tries to confront Krampus and apologize for his actions, he's thrown into a fiery pit. But rather than waking up in hell, he finds himself in his bed with the power back on. It's Christmas morning, and everyone seems fine. At first, he dismisses the experience as a nightmare. That is, until a Christmas bell given to him reawakens his memories, along with everyone else's. The movie ends with the image of Krampus watching him through a snow globe. I mentioned that even though there aren't that many Christmas horror stories, I hadn't seen many of them because I found movie concepts like Silent Night, Deadly Night and Santa's Sleigh too grim against the holidays. My big exemption was Gremlins because it had more of a comedic bent to it. It was clear that Krampus was trying for a similar tone. It almost works, given that the main character Max and Billy from Gremlins were similar, and that when the family gathers, It has the needed characters, and it got a lot of laughs out of me. It's almost like Christmas Vacation in a darker environment. Speaking of which, even the environment feels right, being more ominous and spooky. It's the monsters themselves that are inconsistent. The toys, designed by Weta, certainly look grotesque and do plenty of scary things, but that's what you expect. I was hoping that they'd be having a lot more fun. After all, the gingerbread men are basically gremlins with minions voices. This unfortunately creates a tone that doesn't quite match the more comedic first half. But it's hard to place any blame since there hadn't been a major movie on Krampus before. So, what was the history of Krampus himself? I was able to trace his earliest origins to the Alpine pagan traditions of winter, where Krampus was a combination of several folklore elements of Slavic, Swiss, and German folklore, along with the Wiccan horned god of witches, where the majority of the design would come from. It was during this time period in which Christianity was also spreading its influence thanks to the Holy Roman Empire. One figure who was becoming a part of winter traditions was St. Nicholas, in which by the 11th century, Austria was now celebrating two nights, Krampusnacht on December 5th and St. Nicholas Day on the 6th. Each region, depending on the church's stance, would either accept or reject Krampus, which is why he never spread all over Europe. By the 1890s, Krampus was appearing on Austrian Christmas cards, the tradition itself new having started 10 years earlier. The Victorian-style illustrations gave him his image that we know today, with goat legs and large horns, along with swatches to beat naughty children, or even a bag to take them away. The cards continued to be produced until World War I, when the country would go through decades of political turmoil, in which by the 30s, with the leaders being fascist, banned the use of Krampus. Even up to the 1950s, government officials discouraged Krampus in local traditions, and thus remained a landlocked monster. It wouldn't be until the early 2000s in which Krampus would breathe a brand new digital life. With the emergence of websites, especially of folklore, Americans would start to learn about the Austrian creature, surprised he was a part of a time of year that was really meant to be warm and maybe even a tad sugary. Krampus got a bigger boost thanks to a Chicago illustrator named Monte Beauchamp, who in 2004 organized the first art show on the monster and even published a hardcover book called Krampus, the Devil of Christmas. This is probably the most extensive collection of the Victorian cards and can still be bought today on Amazon. Animator Michael Dougherty, who is now going into film directing, had also discovered Krampus around the same time thanks to friends who sent him a copy of the cards. He was already into monsters, but Krampus was nothing like he had ever seen before. He knew he needed to do something about this with him. So, what was the process like? Why did he want to create a family film over a horror film? How did he acquire his cast? What about the effects? And most importantly, what does this mean for the other holiday monsters? It's time to summon a darker side of the holiday and go forth. This is part 2 of the Krampus story. Given that much of the vision for Krampus came from Michael Dougherty, let's talk about him. Film geeks like myself know him recently for his work on the cult hit Trick or Treat and Godzilla King of the Monsters, not to mention his story work on Godzilla vs. Kong. This is a guy who loves his monsters big or small. It seems like he would be a perfect match for bringing a Christmas monster to life. So, how did he get into that? Growing up in Cleveland, he was already used to the typical small-town Americana image, despite coming from a mixed background, with his Vietnamese side coming from his mother. The monsters would come for him early, as he's talked about in one of his first memories, that of sitting on Santa's lap. According to his words, his little 3-year-old self took a seat, saw this big man staring into his eyes, asking what he wanted. People can forget how scary this can be for a little toddler. This was the case for little Michael, as he responded by crying, demanding for his parents. That wasn't to say he forever disliked Santa, but that seed would be planted into his mind, in which he would now witness Santa having an intimidating side. He's even talked about how the song Santa Claus is Coming to Town has kind of a threatening overtone, with lyrics like, "You better watch out, you better not cry," and of course, "He sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake." Yes, Santa is supposed to keep tabs on which kids have been bad or good, but this also showcases the mythological side of the gift giver. If he simply knows because he's an omnipresent figure, then that also means there's no escape. If he sees you as bad, then there's going to be a punishment in order. This idea stuck with Michael, along with his passion for monsters. In fact, one of them was a new one that he drew up called Santa Claus, and that's Claus as in C-L-A-W-S, which was essentially Krampus before he knew Krampus. He considered writing a story on Santa Claus, but ultimately never did because he thought the monster was, well, too obvious and cheap. From his childhood of collecting comics to studying animation at NYU, the idea of doing a Christmas horror movie was just that, an idea. It was something that he didn't take too seriously until he started his work on Trick or Treat. With the idea of Santa Claus never evolving, he then considered writing a horror story about a figure wearing a Santa suit, similar to Silent Night, Deadly Night, or Christmas Evil, going on a killing spree. Chances are he would have had a bigger challenge selling that, since the 2 prior movies I brought up did face some controversy. It was sometime in 2004 when friends had emailed Michael pictures of the Krampus cards, knowing well he loved monsters. At the same time, he was also doing research on Halloween, or more specifically, on the more pagan origins of it in relation to the story that was developing for Trick or Treat. This would lead him to learn more about Yule, the pagan winter festival, the gods that were worshipped in a pre-Christian Germanic society, how many of the traditions would be changed and even adapted into Christmas, and of course, Krampus. He had finally found the missing piece to his Santa Claus dilemma. This was a shadow of St. Nicholas he was initially afraid of. Krampus may have been a European tradition, but this only added to the mythological side of the holiday. Michael knew that he needed to make a movie on Krampus once he was done with Trick or Treat. Michael got into contact with fellow animator and friend Todd Casey to help co-write the story. Todd Casey was primarily known for his work in animation, dabbling in on a lot of shows including the 2011 Thundercats, the 2015 Ninja Turtles, Star vs. the Forces of Evil, and currently Centaur World on Netflix. Krampus would be his only live-action vehicle as of 2022. Michael and Todd continued to work on Krampus, primarily as a horror story, but it apparently was not working no matter which angle they tried to go at it. They certainly had ideas on Krampus and the other creatures that would join him, but hadn't cracked the kind of story to be featured. They would eventually bring in Zach Shields, who Michael had previously worked on with Trick or Treat's home video content, but was also known for being a fan of Christmas movies. Zach had the other guys rewatch It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Carol to point out 2 important factors they could use for Krampus. First, both movies dealt more into the supernatural side of Christmas, involving ghosts and time travel. Both movies would use those elements to add on to their stories without distracting from the more underlying character plots. Scrooge needed to be a better person through the night. George Bailey needed to see his life was wonderful through a new perspective. The family encountering Krampus would need to do something similar. The second factor was that they were both Christmas movies first and foremost before being labeled as ghost stories or fantasies. Krampus also needed to be a Christmas movie first before being a horror. I should point out that Krampus from the start was always going to focus on a family rather than, say, a couple or even a group of college students. Michael Dougherty may have wanted a monster movie, but he also wanted something that was going to be a tribute to 1980s Amblin movies like Gremlins. It would be a combination of Christmas, family, fantasy, and then horror. When the script was mostly finished, at least within a draft that had the story of a family being visited by Krampus, they made their pitch to Legendary Pictures in 2014. The company, which had gained mega success with the Dark Knight trilogy, the Hangover trilogy, and both Christopher Nolan movies Inception and Interstellar, had also made Michael's feature debut Trick or Treat. Thanks to the cult status of the latter film, they were enthusiastic about supporting his next project. Upon seeing the designs of what Krampus and the other monsters would look like, they approved of the movie. It was then taken to Universal, in which they had a 5-year deal to co-finance and distribute Legendary's movies. Rumor has it that the studio only agreed to help make the movie under the condition that it would remain a PG-13, but I couldn't find any information to verify it. Regardless, the deal set up a $15 million budget for a release sometime in November of 2015. The slightly lower than anticipated budget didn't bother Michael, as he already knew where the majority of money was going to go, into the movie's main character. No, not Max, but that of Krampus, the aspect that he hoped would make it a brand new classic. That's not to say that they weren't going to try to acquire any big names, but the last thing he wanted was for any A-listers to steal the thunder from the main attraction. That's probably why Gremlins still endures after all these years. That's not to say that actors like Zach Galligan and Phoebe Katz didn't try for bigger parts, but let's face it, people love Gremlins for Gremlins. Even had the stars gone on to become major A-listers, it's unlikely to change the perspective that the Gremlins knew that its stars were the monsters. Still, because Krampus himself doesn't show up until towards the second half of the movie, they still needed strong actors that could carry the story of a family needing tough love redemption. To quote casting director Kathy Sandrick, "If you take away all the amazing visuals and the crazy scary stuff, it is a human story about a family that has lost touch and lost their belief. At the end of the day, it's a morality tale." End quote. The challenge was to bring in comedic actors that could sell these characters and yet still give them a sense of vulnerability to showcase the threats. Most of the adults casted, such as Adam Scott, Toni Collette, David Koechner, Allison Tolman, and Conchata Ferrell, were well-established comedic stars coming from Parks and Rec, Anchorman, 2.5 Men, Little Miss Sunshine, and the Fargo TV series, just to name a few. All were filled in on the Gremlins-like tone that Krampus was recreating, and they were all game for the game changer. Despite their star power, however, the movie would need to rely on unknowns to carry the heart. For the role of Max, they had auditioned several boys that ranged between 10 and 14. But upon seeing his performance in Jon Favreau's Son and Chef and his audition, they knew that MJ Anthony would be perfect. Upon bringing Michael Dougherty to approve, MJ not only carried a joy needed for the character of Max, but even showcased some breakdancing talent. For his sister Beth, Stefania Owen, who was American-born but was living in New Zealand. She had a few prior roles, including the Sex and the City prequel series, The Carrie Diaries, but had yet to land a major role. Along with her being casted, when her younger sister Lolo Owen came in with her to the studio, they ended up casting the latter as Stevie, one of the tomboyish cousins of the kids. For the other cousins, Jordan and Howie Jr., New Zealand locals Queenie Samuel and Maverick Flack were casted. The rest would be filled by local actors within the Wellington area of New Zealand. Speaking of New Zealand, I should bring up that the decision to shoot down there came under a number of factors. The big one was financial, as the budget, which I mentioned, was no higher than $20 million. Thanks to the cash grants offered by the local government, several Hollywood productions had taken advantage of the tax incentives, including Avatar, the Alien series, the Ghost in the Shell remake, and much more. Of course, the most well-known to make the shoot is The Lord of the Rings. To say that Peter Jackson making Lord of the Rings did a lot for New Zealand is really an understatement. Without going on too long, Jackson would acquire a co-ownership in the Stone Street Studios in Wellington and help establish a network with his own special effects company, Weta. Weta had already been hard at work with Michael Dougherty and his crew bringing the monsters to life. I'll go into more detail about that a little later in that aspect, but it was important to him that Krampus and the rest of the creatures were mainly physical. It was also important that they hired the best of the best, so Weta was the only special effects company considered. Another factor that brought the production to New Zealand was that they would be able to consolidate everything all in the same place. Shooting, special effects, and even post would now be done in one location, speeding up the schedule of everything. We're going to take a short break, but we'll go into the shooting and release of Krampus when we return.
And now back to the show with our Christmas movie expert, Robert Nicholas.
By March of 2015, the production had all been moved down to New Zealand and filming would begin on the 16th. Krampus would take up most of the sound stages, thanks in part to the decision to film the majority of scenes, including the exterior scenes, all in studio. For a modern movie, this seems very unusual. Most films and TV shows these days would rather take advantage of the natural light that sunshine provides. But with Krampus, sunshine is the last thing it would want. Along with most of the story taking place either at night, darkness, or within snowy environments, much of the plot would take place within the neighborhood and house that the family lives in. It would all need to deteriorate the further the events played out. So along with being able to shoot everything in sequence, which is also a rarity in this day and age, it would be easier for both the cinematographer to help set up the specific kind of lighting and for the crew when it came to generating the artificial snow. In the same case for Home Alone, the main house interiors were built to accommodate for both the main cast and the film crew, which proved somewhat challenging because everything still needed to come out tight. Everything would be scaled up, but even that would sometimes not be enough, such as for the later scene in which the dark elves would pop through the window. On top of the actors and crew, there were suddenly 9 stunt performers that were all blocked according to Michael's direction. According to him, that's when it dawned upon him that the movie they were making was weird. The scaling would prove beneficial when they needed to change certain elements as the family situation got worse. A great example was the chimney. 3 were built so that one was a genuine fireplace, while 2 others were softer versions that could be used for the action scenes, like when Howie Jr. was pulled up, or when Krampus was making his descent. Another soundstage would house the neighborhood, though in order to accommodate its larger intended size, the houses across the street and on the further sides were scaled down. The trees too needed to be shrunken. This is a classic movie trick done in order to keep those wide shots from the sky up and to be ready to alter them quickly as the snow would get worse. In fact, speaking of which, let's talk about that for a moment. The other benefit of shooting everywhere in studio was that it was easier to control the weather. Even if you were to find the right location with real snow, you'd be hard-pressed to plan for a blizzard. Not to mention that because of New Zealand's position on the Earth, it was technically Christmas in autumn time. They had no choice but to do it all in-house. It was created using a combination of modern artificial snow and wind machines, in which the further the story got, the more it would pick up. Some might think it would have been easier to CGI in the snow, but given how many scenes would have required that would have been impossible, and it just made much more sense to go practical, using a British company called Snow Business International. The snow this time was a paper-based combination of cellulose that was blown in through 5 machines. Falling snow was made through a foam-like substance, which is actually the same as the falling snow at the Disney parks. One soundstage had a set that utilized both the neighborhood and the film's climax, in which the ground opens up to the gates of hell. The only scene that required to go off studio was the film's beginning that took place at an unnamed Walmart-type location. They used a nearby mall in Wellington that certainly had the space. This would also become the hardest scene to shoot. Not because of staging or action, though it did play some factor. No, it was rather one of the few things that studio couldn't control: time. Because the mall was still a popular shopping spot for the community, the location was only allowed to close for one day. Anyone that's worked on a film set will tell you that this is the worst thing to hear. One day is barely enough time to get in a day's worth on angles, let alone an entire sequence. The production team not only had to recreate the entirety of the store with several generic fake brands for sale, but it also had to be decorated for Christmas and the school pageant show that was also taking place. According to production designer Jules Cook, they only had one night to put it all up, shoot the whole thing, and one more night to take it all down. With Easter coming the day after, getting a second day was not an option. As soon as the last decorations were set in place, the long day commenced with 250 extras all getting the direction needed for the various gags: fighting, grabbing, biting, and of course, getting tased by security. I should mention that before the climax was eventually written to be set in the neighborhood, I managed to get an original draft script that showed a different third act, set back at the store. This probably would have been too expensive with the budget allocated, but this seems like the only example of a Michael Dougherty vision that they had to draw a line on. In the script, the movie played out as normal, but things changed once the family got to the snowplow to make the escape. After encountering a giant snow monster, which would have at least given us some closure on the snowman that were haunting the family earlier, instead of going to a field in his neighborhood, Max would instead have been drawn back to the store. He would have found the place redone to be Krampus's North Pole, which, design-wise, would have been a cross of the Walmart-style box store and an old-world Austrian workshop. This is where Max would have found where his family was taken, and where he would have confronted the beast before being thrown into hell. It still would have ended up on the ambiguous Christmas morning. Along with budget concerns, I think the reason this climax wasn't used was mainly not only to put Max into Krampus's world a bit more than a store could. I prefer a scenario where you weren't too sure if the family was simply taken away or even killed. It's its implied nature that sells scares, not design. Thanks to the sequence schedule and shooting in-house, filming finished on May 15th. Thanks to a lot of help from the special effects company Weta and Michael's insistence on practical effects over CGI, there wasn't too much that needed to be done digitally. In fact, because Krampus was shot on high-definition cameras, dailies were instantly ready to be observed, and if they were the takes to be printed, could already be sent in for color compositing and anything digital that did need to be put in. One such sequence that required to be all digital was Omni's flashback to her encounter with Krampus. Originally, when Omni was going to be written as a deaf character, her story was going to be told in the form of shadow puppets, which itself would have been interesting. But once it was decided to make her Austrian, the sequence ended up being a combination of German expressionism backgrounds and a stop-motion figure of Omni as a little girl. The tale of her against the backdrop of an implied World War II only made her encounter with Krampus more tragic. If the term German expressionism sounds familiar, then you may remember that from the design style of a lot of Tim Burton films, including Batman, Beetlejuice, and of course, his production of The Nightmare Before Christmas. The decision to go with this was to draw a stronger connection to both the Krampus legend and Omni's personal connection to Europe. I'm not sure how long it took to finish the sequence, but the team at Weta were told to use computers, but make sure it doesn't look like it. It sure fooled me. I actually thought that Omni's stop motion look was actually stop motion. Another detail that they had no choice but to go digital was the first encounter with Krampus, in which Max's sister Beth is walking to her boyfriend's home, only to see the hooded creature hopping from rooftop to rooftop, clearly seeing her as his first target to hunt. Though Krampus was mainly a physical performance by stuntman Luke Hawker, who took it upon himself to create the darker shadow of St. Nicholas, having him jump would have been too much. This is probably the only moment of the movie where the effect is unfortunately obvious. I just never bought that Krampus could make the jump without him being too heavy. It would have been better if he'd simply disappeared and reappeared, but I also understand why they needed to showcase a physical threat as well as a metaphorical one. I just think they could have done it, or maybe found a better solution around that. At least with everything in-house, the post-production went on without any other major issue, since Michael could easily check in with his teams without any major travel. Michael was known for being efficient with the way the schedule was coordinated. In fact, his only remaining element that he had to wait upon was the movie's soundtrack. Like I mentioned on my episode of Home Alone, music can either make or break a movie. In the case of Krampus, it really amplifies the story, even though it also breaks the traditional rules for a horror movie. Michael was keen on carrying over a similar tone from Gremlins, and that included the really good score done by Jerry Goldsmith. That movie's score was able to combine Christmas for the more joyous parts, something more somber when things needed to get dark, and something playful and mischievous for once the Gremlins attacked. Krampus would need to do something similar. Michael brought in his go-to composer, who had also composed for Trick or Treat, Douglas Pipes. Douglas, as a UCLA graduate, had already experienced indwelling in family-friendly scary stories, with his first major work being Monster House. If you haven't seen that underrated masterpiece, stop the episode and go watch that. Along with being a fun movie for all ages, the music replicates a Spielberg emblem style that almost sounds like Alan Silvestri. It turned out that Douglas was a big fan of movies for kids that pushed the boundaries. As soon as Michael had showed him the script for Krampus, along with images of the cold Christmas cards, he immediately agreed to work on it. The score itself would be a combination of the Jerry Goldsmith style from Gremlins, along with the darker renditions of Christmas carols, and even the percussion tribal beats that one could imagine would be heard during the pagan winter celebrations. This primarily became more present when Krampus finally makes his appearance down the chimney, but it would be a nice touch that only connects Krampus further to his roots. It would also give the movie an extra sense of terror, almost like you were walking into the gates of hell. In addition to the music, we also got a new carol to go with the movie. And I mean a carol with a capital K. Using the high school choir from the Brenda Olinda High School, he crafted a rescore of Carol the Bells and lyrics rewritten about watching out for Krampus. While it doesn't quite sound as European as the rest of the score, It's a fun exclamation point for the movie. The movie would finish post ahead of schedule, which now the hard part was about to happen. They were about to see what a mainstream audience would think of a past Christmas return. The movie was initially going to be released on Thanksgiving of 2015, but then it was pushed to December 4th. This was probably for the best, as Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2 was already out, and it would have had to compete with the new Rocky spin-off Creed and the newest Pixar movie, The Good Dinosaur. In addition to having December 4th to itself with no competition, it would also perfectly align with the Austrian Krampus. They couldn't have planned it any better. Because of that, most of the international markets would also open the same day. It would open at number 1 that Friday before ending behind Mockingjay Part 2 in second place, but managing to gross a respectable $16 million domestically, even managing to beat out both Creed and The Good Dinosaur. Yes, Krampus managed to beat Disney. It's also impressive since that it's been a while that a Christmas horror was given a theatrical release. It would play favorably to both a horror crowd and even a Christmas crowd. As a family film, it was in a more competitive position. Not a bad one as it beat Pixar, but it would have been a hard sell anyway. Though it would have a drop by almost 50% the next weekend, it managed to play nicely, as it did in the foreign markets. But by the third week, it gained a bigger competitor that came out swinging hard. A little movie called Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Not that it was intending to beat it, but I have to give Krampus credit for having the guts to come out so close to what was essentially one of the most anticipated movies at the time. Oddly enough, Krampus was not screened for the critics beforehand, but that didn't stop the critics from chiming in later on anyway. Overall, their opinion was kind of mixed on the movie. While there was a lot of support for those that applauded the spooky tone and the design of the monsters, much of the criticism was that it failed to balance its family, comedy, and horror genres together. Time magazine called the project too dumb, while AV Club saw a movie that didn't go far enough in either comedy or in horror. Noel Murray of the Los Angeles Times did defend it, who felt it wasn't unique enough to be a new classic. Audiences seemed to be about the same, with some feeling that it was a fun alternative Christmas movie, while others felt the scarier moments were too slow to come. Regardless, it continued to play in theaters until Martin Luther King Jr. weekend of 2016, where on a worldwide gross, it brought in $61 million for Universal, making back triple its budget, thus making it a hit. So if it did make money, why haven't we seen more Christmas horror stories, or perhaps even another Christmas monster on film? Well, first of all, Krampus may have been a hit, but it was only a small hit. By 2019, small profits are not exactly what major movie studios are looking for, especially on a theatrical scale. Second, Christmas movies can be a good thing to sell, but as of now, Christmas horror still remains risky. The most recent example probably would be 2019's Black Christmas remake, which itself sucked. I'll definitely get around to the Black Christmas movies at some point, but that remake may have set back traditional Christmas horror movies all the way back to square one. If anything, holiday horror may have more of a life on streaming thanks to places like Netflix and Shudder. Go watch any of the Christmas specials of The Last Drive-In starring Joe Bob Briggs if you want proof. As of 2022, Krampus has yet to make another major movie. Michael Dougherty had taken a nice step up with Godzilla King of the Monsters, and not to mention getting the full story credit for Godzilla vs. Kong. Though no sequel for Krampus is planned, a new cut of the film was released on Blu-ray in 2021 called the Naughty Edition. I haven't seen it yet, but it apparently adds in scenes that were taken out to ensure a PG-13 rating. I went in to read the reviews only to find that they apparently didn't bring a lot more to Krampus other than a few extra scares. I doubt it would have helped the movie at the box office, but it's nice to know that a naughtier version is available for those that want it. It's funny that I initially first saw Krampus with the thought that horror has no place within Christmas. If anything, the movie in this episode forced me to look into the history of the holiday even before Christ. It was fun to learn more about the pagan winter traditions and how something like that could inspire a different kind of St. Nicholas, in which I had a hard time believing could have had an American retelling. Krampus may not be the funniest or scariest or even most sentimental of the Christmas genre, but it made me appreciate the talent that still went into it, especially within the idea. I personally hope that we do get another shot at those other holiday monsters, perhaps with the Icelandic Yule Lads, or that of Belschnickel. If anything, it would at least reflect on just how diverse the holiday can be. The movie may not be for everyone, but I can say that I still recommend it, despite my issues with the tone. Turn out the lights and only let the dark glow of the Christmas lights come as a source of comfort. It's a journey that can be tough, but it also hides an undeniable truth. That with the season, we do need to showcase our love for others even if we don't get along with them. So be good and watch out, and don't cry. I'm telling you why. If you don't keep up the spirit with you year-round, then Krampus will come to town. Just hope he at least chooses to leave a bell with you.
Thank you for joining us on this sleigh ride into the magical world of Christmas movies. Check us out for weekly rides into your favorite Christmas classics and their histories. Be sure to give us a positive review on iTunes if you like what you heard. And don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook and Instagram for updates and special news. Consider subscribing on Patreon in order to help keep the show going and to gain access to some special gifts not available to the public. Merry Monday to all, and to all a good night. See you next week.
Cut. Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.